You're listening to The Inspire Me Show with hostess Layla Ashley, hypnotherapist, life coach, author, and speaker. The Inspire Me Show is dedicated to bringing passion and inspiration into your life and your relationships. While side effects of listening to this show may include greater feelings of love, joy, and creative inspiration, please note that this show is meant to entertain and inform and is not a replacement for professional help. Learn more at www.laylaashley.com. And now, right here on KPFK, in the spirit of love, empowerment, and freedom, your hostess, Layla Ashley.
Welcome to the Inspire Me Show, everyone. Today, I welcome my in-studio guest, the brilliant Austin Coppock. Austin is an astrologer, author, and teacher based in Los Angeles, California. He's also the current president of the Association for Young Astrologers. Known for his distinctive poetic writing style and ability to reconcile modern approaches with traditional techniques, Austin's work encompasses the critical overlap between astrology and magical traditions such as Hermeticism. His works regularly appear in publications such as The Mountain Astrologer. He has given numerous interviews on the subjects of astrology, tarot, and esotericism, and is a frequent speaker at conferences throughout the United States, including such events as the Esoteric Book Conference and the Northwestern Astrology Conference. His digital appearances include the Astrology Podcast and A Cult of Personality. Austin's groundbreaking work, 36 Faces, was met with wide acclaim from reviewers and fans alike, as did the annual almanac he wrote from 2011 through 2015. Austin continues to publish original articles on his website, give private consultations, and teach a variety of classes online. Welcome to the Inspire Me Show, Austin. So great to have you here in studio.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here.
Wonderful. So why don't we begin by letting people know a little bit about your background and how you became involved in astrology and esotericism.
Okay, well, that can be a very short story or that can be a very long story.
Take your time.
Okay, I'll do the medium short version. I was raised without any sort of metaphysical backdrop. My family was not religious in any way, shape, or form, which was nice in some ways. But I always felt like there was something missing. There was something beyond the visible sky. There was something outside of that. And so, I read all the books that I could. My parents had a big hippie bookshelf full of Aldous Huxley and Carlos Castaneda and all that. And as I went off to college, I ended up discovering astrology sort of by accident. I'd encountered it before in newspapers, but it always seemed profoundly silly to me back then. I didn't understand that it was actually a complex and demanding system. And it was really in my early 20s that I started with astrology, and I'd been doing martial arts since I was, 11. But I was introduced to what some people might call internal martial arts, such as Tai Chi, where the physical movements and combat techniques are integrated with, sort of intertwined with energy work, or what they call Qigong in Chinese traditions. And then things just got weirder from there.
And we'll leave out the weird part, right? No, we're here today to discuss all that. So, yeah, thank you for that introduction. That's incredible that you just kind of came through with your own inspiration and without any background in it. It's something called you to it.
Yeah, I didn't. In some ways, having say like a negative background in the sense that I was wholly unprepared. Was I think ended up being pretty helpful. I wasn't full of ideas about how reality worked other than physics and biology, right? Which only describe out to a certain distance reality. And so I didn't have ideas about how a god or gods was supposed to work. I didn't have anything to tear down. To a certain degree, it meant that I also didn't have building materials. But, there's a state which is highly valued in a lot of spiritual or magical traditions, which has different names and different traditions. In the Chinese system, it's called Wu Qi. And so Wu Qi speaks to the fertile chaos that comes before anything exists. It's that sort of pre-existent void state. But when we say void, we usually say void to mean something which is empty or lacking. But Wu Qi, as well as its parallels in a lot of other traditions, is considered to be the most full state. It's full of everything that could possibly be. And so, in a sense, I was fertile soil, right? There's nothing in the way of that, right? The energy hadn't been dedicated to one particular form or another.
Right.
So sometimes no preparation is the best preparation.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Yeah. You just went from there and you really had something to create and build and discover from there. So discuss a bit about the relationship between astrology and Western esotericism, such as alchemy and the Hermetic tradition.
Okay. Well, a good place to start with that is that in what gets called the Hermetic tradition. The Hermetic tradition generally is considered to have three arts which make it up. And one of those three arts is astrology. Another one of those arts is alchemy. And the third of those arts often gets called the theurgy. We can just call it magic, right? And that's the Hermetic trinity. And so it's interesting, the Hermetic tradition is named for Hermes. Hermes is very similar to the Roman Mercury, and Hermes was a god of the mind, right? That's why he had winged sandals and he could go anywhere he wanted, because even though our bodies can move but slowly, they can't go very far. Whereas the mind, I can say, imagine a mountain peak, and your mind can instantly be there, right? So the mind is extremely mobile. And what's interesting to me, is Hermes or Mercury rules over not just this sort of imaginative mind or the visualizing mind, but also the rational intellectual mind. And so what fascinated me about, and what still fascinates me about what we're calling the Hermetic tradition, is that alchemy, astrology, and magic are all spiritual disciplines that nonetheless have a profound intellectual component. There's this issue of what to do with the intellect in a lot of spiritual traditions, and one answer is to make it wait at the door, right? And that has value and is necessary for certain processes. However, this is, I think, particularly difficult for contemporary North Americans. We live a lot of our lives in our intellect because our lives demand a lot intellectually from us. Things are complicated, right? You got to figure it out, whether it's your phone bill or your life path or whatever. And so what the Hermetic tradition's arts do is, I would say that they dignify the intellect. There are conceptual structures and processes and ideas which, as you encounter them, prepare the mind in such a way that it can appreciate that which is usually beyond the rational without shutting off entirely. So you're basically turning the mind into something which you don't have to leave at the door of the meditation hall because it's not going to get in your way as much. And that was useful for me. I was raised in a very intellectual family culture, and I'd done a lot with my mind. And if you get rewarded a lot in our world if you're smart, right?
True.
And so it was nice to find a series of arts that worked with what I had rather than saying, you have to leave that behind. Furthermore, what's interesting about astrology, just to take one of them, but is actually true of all three, is that they are all experimental arts. What's interesting, that term experimental is interesting to me because we usually think of it in a modern laboratory context. But if you look at, say, the Picatrix, which is an 11th century book of astrology and magic. With all of the different recipes and procedures that are described, you're reminded constantly that this is an experimental art. So you have to do this and then see what happens. You're not supposed to take on faith that this is the gospel. You're supposed to do things and then see what happens and record your results.
I like that. So you're integrating what you already have, the foundation you already have to yourself, into an experience of something greater, rather than seeing it as a dichotomy between, okay, you need to choose between your mind and spirituality or what is beyond that.
Yeah, because that's problematic. It's hard to, for one thing, it's hard to get somebody who's got an extremely well-developed intellect to just totally leave that at the door.
Yeah.
Right. And it also, it runs the risk of creating stupid spirituality. If you're not allowed to be smart and spiritual at the same time, that's where you get soulless intellect and stupid spirituality. And there's lots of that.
And it creates, it's so true. That's a really good point. It also creates resistance because if your intellect is such a part of who you are and your identity, then the unconscious mind is not going to be okay with someone asking you to give that up.
Yeah, and if you just know it's really, really useful, it got you through school.
Yeah, yeah, and like you said, it opens doors and it leads, it points the way. It's arrows pointing the way on your path.
Yeah, Hermes was a guide, but not the destination. And I think that that's maybe not a bad way to look at the intellect. It can help get you to places, but it is not the place you're trying to get to.
Right. I certainly learned that. We both have a background in philosophy. My ultimate conclusion coming out of there was the mind cannot solve the ultimate questions. It cannot ultimately solve those things. And it falls short. It always falls short of experience and what is beyond that, because even the mind is conditioned, So we're working through our conditioning and not experiencing something outside of that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there used to be, speaking of philosophy, one of philosophy's tasks traditionally is to not just figure out the world rationally, but to figure out the limit of what can be understood rationally, and then to figure out what we're going to do if we want to go beyond that.
Yeah.
Right? That's the traditional distinction between philosophy and theology. Right? That doesn't seem to be very popular anymore, but it seems like a reasonable way to do the project.
Yeah, exactly. Great. So now you take more of a historical, traditional approach to astrology. How much does modern thought influence the art and science of astrology, have you found? And how much do you feel in your own work that it's about preserving tradition versus evolving?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So I'm very interested in and have learned a great deal from we call the historical astrology, or what practitioners call traditional astrology. And that's usually like 16th century and earlier. But this traditional movement in astrology is actually a very new thing. It's actually the cool, modern, hip thing to be doing. What happened about 20 years ago is several groups of astrologers realized that we have the record of practitioners of our art. We have records that go back over 2,000 years, and that we weren't reading any of those books. It's very difficult to find any discipline where you have 2,000 years of legitimate instruction and ideas, right? And you'd be a fool not to, not to see what your ancestors thought.
Yeah.
And so we've been very lucky to have a number of talented scholars who've been going through and have been translating these books from Koine Greek, translating them from Roman Latin, from medieval Arabic, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're just getting to read these. Like people, in the last 20 years, this is the first time a lot of astrologers have gotten to read some of these books in 1,000 years. And so it's for me, it's not that I'm against what people did in the 20th century with astrology. Some of it, I suppose, there are some certain ideas that I would poo-poo at this point, but it's not against that. It's that this is what's happening. We have the opportunity to do this, and what's kind of fascinating and creepy is there there are there are a lot of techniques that are from like a 3rd century Roman guy that just nail modern life, and that will tell you pretty much more or less exactly when something amazing is going to happen for somebody, or what that will illuminate for you when the terrible year will come. And so again, it is an experimental art, and so we can use these techniques and see what they show about human experience and the structure of life events.
So they were prophetic, is what you were saying?
Yeah. I mean, there's been a movement to try to wholly psychologize astrology in the late 20th century. But that just doesn't line up with what happens when you get decent at astrology and you look at the techniques and you say, and there's something supposed to be a good year for money. It's not your feelings about money. That might be involved, but it's literally like there are financial opportunities. And so it becomes increasingly hard in the face of the results that you get to say that it's purely psychological. There's a tremendously powerful psychological application of astrology, but to recognize that something has an application is different from saying it's only one thing. And that was actually a big sort of point of initiation for me. I got into astrology in college, and I was doing a double major in psychology and philosophy, and I was really interested in personality typing systems. I was looking into Jung and all 4 functions and all that, and partially because I wanted to understand what kind of human I was, which I think is a very normal 20-year-old thing to do. And when I encountered astrology, I didn't really think that you could tell anything about the future, or even that it was necessarily that you could read a person's psyche through these points on a circle. What I did think was that it was an incredibly elegant way to map the human psyche, right? You have let's say 9 different parts of the psyche, which are the planets and the sun and the moon, and they're all arranged at different points on a circle, and each part of the circle has a different range of meaning. Those are the zodiac signs. And then not only, so you have these common parts that we all have, but then you have 12 different ways that each of those can manifest or be experienced. And then you have the relationships, the geometrical relationships between those points also meaning something. And so it wasn't like there were 1,000 different categories. There was 9 and 12 and then 5. But out of those, you get millions of combinations. And so I just thought it was beautifully designed. But I didn't think it was magic or anything. And so I was messing around with that, and I read everybody's chart for an order of General Tso's chicken. My rates were very low back then. But then as I got better at it, I started accidentally predicting a bunch of creepy stuff. And I had to sort of take a step back and realize that I wasn't just playing, it wasn't just a psychological game, that a lot of the information depicted in the chart described really important things in a person's life, like really important external things as well as internal things. And so that really took me back, and it took me a couple years of sort of catching my breath and realizing that if I was going to mess with astrology, that it was serious, and that I should probably be serious too.
That's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
And that brings to mind a question about that. So let me ask you, from your work in astrology, how much of reality do you feel is fate, and how much can be influenced by free will and insight and awareness?
Right. Well, and that's what's interesting about that, or one of the things that's interesting about that, is that as far back as we have astrological texts, people were concerned and arguing about that. right?
Yeah.
It's it's a human question even outside of the context of astrology. Astrology just draws it into the foreground. I think that we all have choices. I don't like the word free will because we're never making choices in a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
I can't choose to walk through the wall. Like the wall represents a pretty concrete parameter of my choices.
You could choose, but the wall would disagree, right?
Right. And the wall's will would prevail in that case. So I like choices, right?
Mm-hmm.
And do we have meaningful choices, right? Because we always have choices, but if it's Pepsi or Coke, that's maybe not a meaningful choice, right? I would say everybody has meaningful choices. And then I would say, and this is something that you see in both the astrology and with the almighty power of common sense, is that some people have more choices than other people.
How is that?
Well, let's say that I grew up in a small village in Central Asia where, my parents made what would translate in U.S. dollars to about $500 a year. I would have less choices than if I grew up in Los Angeles and my parents were movie studio execs. Right.
Mm-hmm.
There's just not everybody has the same amount of choices. Let's say you get pneumonia at 3 and you die. Did you have a lot of, is that because that child made a bad choice? Like if we don't, compassion demands that we acknowledge that not everybody has the same number of choices. Because if everybody has exactly the same number of choices, then we have to assume that anything that's good that happens for them is a result of their virtue, and if bad things happen, then it's a result of their failure.
I think that's really important what you said, that compassion demands that we recognize that not everyone has the same choice, because right now, and some people aren't going to like me saying this, but right now, especially in some of the new age trends and some of the psychology self-help trends, there is really this prevailing attitude that you can manifest anything to happen if you set your mind right. And if you don't, it's completely your fault. It's completely your responsibility. Even if you are a 3-month-old who contracts, and then that responsibility, that choice happened before you came into this world. You somehow chose that. And that bothers me a little bit. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that bothers me too. I mean, a lot of the people who are drawn to that perspective often have a lot of choices in their life. And so I think it's very important to take ownership of the power you do have.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that I am the architect of my own reality. Like recognizing that is sort of recognizing that you've been sitting on a throne for a long time and you can do a lot to change things if you don't like how they are. But it just can't be an absolute. And it's important not to project that onto other people. I think it can be a useful framework for people at certain phases of their life. But there's also just stuff that happens, like I don't like to think about it, but my parents are probably going to die at some point. And I don't really have a big choice about when that is. I can say, keep doing your yoga, Mom. But it's really not my call. And that's a big part of my life. A big part of our lives are much bigger than just the us part and what we do for a living.
Right.
That's one thing that the way that the astrological chart is structured makes very clear. The you, the just you is basically 1/12 of the chart. It's 1/12 of the life is the just me, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's just as much space for me as for the people you're really close to.
Mm-hmm.
And there's another space for your family and where you came from that's just as big. Right, and so on and so on.
Right, there are other influences besides our own.
There's more to life than just us. And a lot of if your parents, something terrible happens to your parents and you don't hate their guts, that's going to have a profound effect on you. That's as much part of your life as, whether you're feeling good or not or how things are going for you. Right. And so life is, I think there is a tendency to look at life as just the self, but the self is actually just a small part of life.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
It's like a whole web, and one movement of one part is going to affect the whole structure.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So just back to fate and free will and choices and sometimes a lack thereof. The earliest astrology that we have that looks pretty much exactly like what we have now, same basic technical structure, comes about in the Greco-Roman era. And the construct, or one of the big philosophical ideas behind a lot of the way it's built, comes down to two technical terms, which we usually translate as spirit and fortune. These are touche and daimon in the Greek. And what's really interesting about this is that touche is actually the earlier Greek version of the goddess Fortune, or the goddess Fortuna. And some people may have seen Fortuna with a big wheel, spinning a big wheel, and there are kings and beggars on this wheel, and the beggars are rising up and the kings are being cast down, and represents this wheel of station in life. Now, what's interesting about the Greek precedent, which is touche, is that she was actually depicted as having a sphere or a globe. And the idea was that fortune, things could roll in any direction. It wasn't just a wheel that was orderly. Things could slide to the left, right, forward, backward, et cetera, et cetera. And so touche represented life in the material world where we were subject to accidents, right? And then, so we have we have these material factors which are not necessarily fair or intentional, and where there are accidents, right? And so one of the important things about touche, or fortune, was that she was thought to distribute blindly or irrespective of virtue, right? And so this was sort of a mythological way of understanding the fact that sometimes terrible people are very fortunate, and sometimes very good people are unfortunate, right? Now, this was fortune is contrasted with spirit, and this is the other half of the way they were seeing the chart. And spirit, when we look at spirit, we're looking at what is divine and intelligent and intentional, that which creates order, which is just and coherent. And so they saw human life as the interplay of these two forces, of the intelligent and the blind, right? And so you can see this in very simple. I think one great way to apply this is looking at coincidences, right? Okay. There are coincidences that are not coincidences, right? Like a black dog crosses your path 5 times in one day, right? And you don't own a black dog. And you look it up in some sort of animal symbolism website, and it's exactly what's happening to you, right? Mm-hmm. But then sometimes you just stub your toe a couple times, and it's not really this big message. You just stubbed your toe, right?
Yeah. And
so figuring out what's a meaningful coincidence, what is in a sense ordered by or a message from spirit versus what's just the world, right? Because if we don't allow, I think people, in wanting to escape from a meaningless materialist world, sometimes overdo it on finding meaning and try to make everything equally meaningful.
Right. But it's really a control strategy behind it. I mean, to get a little psychological on it, it's really that we need to feel like we can be that influence, that final influence in our reality. And then we don't let those other influences in that you're discussing.
Right. Well, it's like what's an omen for us? What's like meaningful? What's leading us along the way? What's the universe speaking to us? And what is us projecting? And we have to allow for both of those. Or nothing has meaning, or everything has meaning. And if everything has the same amount of meaning, then then we're overwhelmed with information, and we can't really. That doesn't help at all.
Right. What have you found useful in getting past the projection, which I would see as kind of a psychological condition, even though it's kind of in the unconscious mirroring? What would you suggest is the best way you found to get past that and see deeper into reality?
Oh, well, I mean, projection on a general level is probably too big for me to think about right now.
Yeah.
On a simple level of like what are meaningful patterns in your life versus what is just stuff that happened. I like the rule of three.
Okay.
A rule of three is pretty simple. It shows up in a lot of cultures. If something very distinct and unlikely happens 3 times in a short time frame, then that's probably meaningful. Twice is really easy to have. Twice happens accidentally, really easy. But the third one takes it out of that low probability. And so, just rule of three. Sometimes you want things to be an omen. You're like, oh, this means things are going to go really well. Or, oh, this is going to confirm my fears about, how terribly things are going to go. But rule of three is a good sort of rule of thumb.
I like that. It's simple, but it's something that anyone can watch for in their day-to-day existence.
Yeah. And if it's real, if the invisible parts of your life are really trying to send the visible part of your life a message, it's not going to stop at 1 or 2.
Right. And you begin to get into synchronicity and all that.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. And now, kind of related to the question I had posed about fate versus choice or free will. So in astrology, you teach and your work is about our chart specifically, or just astrological influences, broadly speaking, how those things influence us. Now, my question is, how can we influence our own chart? Through maybe esotericism or just other awareness?
That's a good question. So one way, there are a couple different things people have done with the information that you get from astrology. One is to imagine that it's all wholly external and that it's just they're symbols of life messing with you, or maybe they're scary gods or archons or something. So we're gonna put that to the side. Another idea is that the planets themselves represent pieces of us, and you can see this in the alchemical tradition very clearly. And so everybody has a Mercury. Let's go back to Mercury. So Mercury is the intellect and the mind's ability to fly and to go high and to go low, right? And so you have one of those, right? There's one in the sky, and then there's one in your head. And so the position of Mercury when you're born and its relationships to the other planets usually tells you something. Actually, I would say always tells you something about your mind and what your mind is naturally going to be good at, what it's naturally going to have a harder time with, et cetera, et cetera. But you can construct a self-knowledge and development project around that sphere of your life, right? Mercury is about our communications with others, our ability to translate experiences into words, right? And our ability to translate words into other words or into numbers, and those numbers into words, right? All of those little clever, all of those little clever translations are Mercury's domain. And so, although the chart will give you an idea of what role that planet, in this case Mercury, is likely to play in your life, as well as whether that will be easier or harder, and what parts of that sphere are going to come easily to you, or which ones are going to be more difficult. Just because there are parameters doesn't mean that you can't grow or become more dignified within those parameters. Right? There's a ton of room for growth.
Certainly.
When people, you can look at a chart and you can imagine the worst possible version of life that comes from that, and the best possible life. And the two will have a lot of parallels, especially in timing, but one you would much rather live than the other. So I do think that there's some give there. It's not a wholly fatalistic system.
That's magnificent, because some people are, would you agree, set up chart-wise. They've kind of been dealt a bad hand, you might say, worse than others. Another person might be been dealt all aces and they're like, woo, So, how do you reconcile that? I think, by looking at how that other person can work with their chart and their setup to grow from it, I guess is what you're saying. That there's all that room to grow and evolve from it.
Yeah, and also a lot of time, one thing I see a lot is that some people have the first 25 years are going to be really hard, right? But then things open up after that, but then it's sort of up to the person whether they want to keep repeating the first 25 years, because you don't, again, we're talking about choices, you don't, you may have been a participant in the parent-child dynamics of where you grew up, but it's not like you were making choices. You were 8, right? But then when, let's say, you're 30, you can, you have the capability to sort of take a step back and undo or rewire some of those patterns. Another issue that comes into this fate free will thing is we could perhaps refer to by the word destiny, right? Because when there's a fixed pattern for our life and we don't like it, we call it fate, right? We rage against fate. But everybody wants a destiny, right? It's the same thing. It's just the version that we like.
Right.
And
True.
So, another way of looking at the limited parameters of the chart is that there is a destiny which is trying to take place, right? And that we probably need to cooperate with it in order to bring it about. Because, when we go very deep into ourselves, we usually don't find that we want to do and want to be everything. There's usually we feel called to be a certain someone and to play a certain role in the collective and play a certain role for the people in our lives. We are pulled in a certain limited number of directions, if we're just being honest. And so we can also look at the limitation of absolute 360-degree free will that's represented in astrology as the consistent gravity of our destiny, right?
Right.
And I think some people have that, it seems like served up to them on a platter. And some people, it seems like they never get to live that out. Like things just happen and they don't get very close to that. I think most people are in a position where they feel that pull sometimes and then they lose it other times. And that there are a great number of choices to make about, how closely that sort of ideal, that destiny. And a destiny is not an ideal life. Right? An ideal life is just, most of the time, is just people imagining not having any difficulties. Whereas what we feel pulled to, and if you talk to people who are living exactly the life that they want, there are always intense challenges which are part of that. Right? It's defined like your heroic story. I feel like destiny is always heroic, and because I think that the spirit of human beings is inherently heroic and wants to wrestle with something tremendous. I don't think that we incarnate. I don't think we take on flesh so that we can be comfortable and then die. Right? Like why bother existing in the material world if you don't want a little friction? I guess the food's good.
Yeah, and I mean, it's human nature to want to get away from struggle and difficulty and challenges. But at the same time, you're saying just to get through it is the point, to come out the other side and evolve. That's the alchemy of it, I guess you could say, is that in that process you become someone different. But without having gone through that, it's kind of like just flat soda or something. There's no depth or, Yeah,
if we're going to use, if we can do an alchemical metaphor, alchemical metaphors are very useful for describing even totally invisible psychological things, but they're all basically chemistry metaphors, right? How do you change a substance into another substance? Right, and one of the requirements for almost all alchemical operations is heat, right?
Mm-hmm.
You gotta heat things up. Like you can take iron dug up from the earth and turn it into a gleaming sword. But you don't do that by just holding it and thinking change, right? You have to apply, thousands of degrees of heat for
Yeah.
what is fixed to become liquid again, and then it can be reformed and reshaped.
Surely.
And so, yeah, certain struggles or ordeals people have the benefit of kind of melting you down and allowing you to giving you the opportunity to reshape yourself.
Right.
And I would also just say that, even though on an everyday level we're like, oh no, I have to go to the post office. Oh no, I have to go back to the DMV. On a deeper level, I think that within everyone there is a sort of heroic spark that is more than the equal of life's challenges. And I would say that the main difference there is what are meaningful challenges and what are challenges which just seem, pointless, right? And I think the practice of trying to stock our life with meaningful challenges versus just, I guess I'm just going to deal with this.
That's a really great point for the preservation and directing of energy, because like you and I were talking about before the show, energy can just simply leak out if you don't, sort of seal it and direct it the right way and manage it. And I think most people really don't do that unless they have a practice or an intention or something that they've pursued to do that.
Yeah. That practice we're talking about sealing, right?
Yeah.
Because if you've, even though at some level consciousness is infinite and all that, on like a level anywhere near the surface of life, energy is limited, right? And even if you're able to cultivate a great deal of energy or gather a great deal of energy, it's hard to keep energy all in one place. It wants to just go out everywhere. You think about the times where you feel really strong and capable. It's really easy, you start getting less picky about what you do because you're like, I can do anything, and you can until that charge runs out.
Right.
And so getting in the habit of, to a certain degree, it's just picking your battles. But keeping a seal on things and making that your assertions into the world intentional and precise rather than just reactive.
Right.
Let's say we're talking about our tank of gasoline. It's very important to keep your tank of gasoline sealed. Right? You don't want like random sparks falling
Probably
in there.
not. Yeah, that's a good point. And you and I were talking about that in the context of our Qigong practice, which we have another thing in common there with Carl Totten, who we'll give a shout out to.
Yes. Hey, Dr. Tartan.
Hey, he was on another one of my shows as well. Wonderful, wonderful individual who has taught us much.
Indeed. An amazing human being.
Yes, absolutely. So talk a little bit more about how people can use astrology to better their lives on a day-to-day basis.
Okay. Well, there are, I would say, two things. One of the applications of astrology is to get to know yourself, right? And by that I mean get to know your entire chart, which is not just you're born in the middle of March, you're a Pisces, right? That's like one of many, 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 many important things that the chart has to say about you, right? It is true, the sun is in tropical Pisces in the middle of March, but that's a radical simplification of astrology that's gotten popularized because it doesn't require your individual birth date and place and time. And you can't write a newspaper column about about 7 billion people, right? It's not untrue. It's just like one little data point. But getting to know your chart, but that's a project. Astrology has been historically practiced by some of the brightest human beings that have ever lived. A lot of our saints of science were actually astrologers. Kepler, Johannes Kepler is a good example. Isaac Newton is another good example. there is this tendency to say, oh, it's great and everybody can do it. It's super fun. But it's a little bit hard. And so I wouldn't say that study is for everyone. You can learn your chart better. Much easier than that, and actually how it was used historically, is basically to get a good idea of what the weather is coming up. One really, really helpful sort of part of astrology is looking at where the planets are going to be in relationship to our sky and each other, and to get an idea whether we're in for a rough month, whether things are going to be a little easier, whether things are going to be really good for 1 week or whatever, and just basically treating it like a psychic weather forecast. One of the things that got me interested in astrology a long time ago was that I noticed that there was such a thing as good times and bad times. That there'd just be like a weird bad energy. There'd just be like some weird bad vibe around for a week or two, and that everybody reacted to it and dealt with it in different ways. But it was just kind of there and everybody was dealing with it. Mm-hmm. Or, there was just sort of a really great time where it seemed like everybody was getting their version of a reward from their life.
Mm-hmm. Like something in the air is what people would say.
There's something in the air. Mm-hmm. And astrology is really good at predicting what kind of psychic weather there's going to be. It gets really interesting when you know your chart, you know exactly how that's going to hit you. But even not knowing your chart, just kind of knowing what's coming up is really helpful. And so there are a number of astrologers who do that sort of work. I do that sort of work. I write a weekly column on the internet, mm-hmm. And that's on my website, which is just my name, AustinCoppock.com. I also participate in a monthly roundtable discussion of what the month looks like on the Astrology podcast, which you can just find by searching the Astrology podcast.
Yeah.
But it's just really practical and useful. I know a lot of people who've come to, they just check on the day or the week, and just make some practical decisions based on that. A lot of life centers around our ability to generate reasonable expectations, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And if we know it's like, okay, this is kind of a pain in the ass, but we just need to get through it, and things look better in a couple of weeks, or that this is a really high point, and we need to A, not waste it, and B, we need to not assume that this is just how it is. Mm-hmm. And we get really attached to when things are going well, and then we get very sad when suddenly things go back to normal.
Right. Well, sounds a lot more interesting than just pulling out today's paper with the horoscope and looking up your sign.
Yeah. And, to be fair, I do horoscopes. I do attach those to the end of it. Mm-hmm. But I write maybe 2,000 words about what's happening. And there's a little bit about each sign. Because that's fun. And if you know more about astrology, you can get more out of that. Yeah. But the emphasis is on here's the psychic weather. Here are the best symbols for understanding it. And then, we can do some fun horoscope stuff too.
Right. That's fantastic. Thanks for joining us for part 1 of this 2-part interview with Austin Coppock. For more information on Austin, visit AustinCoppock.com. Tune in to part 2 on the next episode of The Inspire Me Show.
Thank you for listening to The Inspire Me Show with hostess Layla Ashley, hypnotherapist, life coach, author, and speaker. Find out more about Layla's services and products at laylaashley.com. The Inspire Me Show is dedicated to bringing passion and inspiration into your life and your relationships. Join Layla on her next episode of this regular program here on KPFK. Until then, live in the spirit of inspiration.